It is a pleasure to welcome all of you to this special event organized by the International Transport Forum on the last day of the UNFCCC Climate Change Dialogues 2020. Over the past 2 weeks, we've heard about the importance to continue exchanging views and sharing information between observers and parties to maintain momentum in the UNFCCC process and to showcase how climate action is progressing under the various circumstances experienced by different countries. As an active member of the UNFCCC Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, and a focal point for transport, the International Transport Forum is committed to mobilize the transport sector and to also identify key topics for discussion and to help enhance the engagement of the transport sector in the decarbonization dialogue. In this special event, we have prepared 4 different sessions focusing on tools to help parties develop climate actions and measures, as well as ways to develop pathways to decarbonize transport on both national and city levels. We hope to go deeper into the road freight sector to highlight opportunities that already exist for a net carbon future. Thank you all again for joining us in this ITF special event, which is also being streamed live on Twitter. And it is now my pleasure to begin the event by introducing the 2 speakers in our first session, Mr. Jari Kaupala, Head of Secretary General's Office and Head of Quantitative Policy Analysis and Foresight of the ITF, and Ms. Orla McCarthy, Modeler and Analyst at the ITF, who will introduce the ITF's Decarbonizing Transport Initiative, as well as tools that we've prepared to help parties decarbonize the sector.
Thank you, Wei Xuan, and thank you all for joining this ITF special event. For those who don't know, International Transport Forum, we are an intergovernmental organization, part of the OECD family. We work for 62 member governments on better transport policies. Our member governments include all the OECD countries, but also expand to emerging economies and to economies around the world, including China, India, Russia, etc. I will just very briefly introduce our Decarbonizing Transport Initiative at the ITF. Right after the Paris signing of the Paris Agreement in 2016, we launched the ITF Decarbonizing Transport Initiative. The objective of this initiative was really to support our member governments and other stakeholders in the transport sector to move from ambition to action. We are not working on this by ourselves alone. While we have certain key enablers in the initiative, including our in-house modeling framework that covers all modes of transport, both freight and passenger, projecting transport activity, transport demand, and related CO2 emissions all the way up to 2050 under different policy scenarios. This is an important tool for us to understand how different policies will translate into reductions of CO2 emissions or changes in mode shares and so on. As I said, we are not working on this initiative by ourselves. We have over 70 partners in addition to our member governments from the private sector, including our corporate partnership board from sectoral organizations such as the International Road Transportation Union, intergovernmental organizations, multilateral development banks, etc., and academia. We do not want to reinvent the wheel in this work, but we really rely on the evidence and the work done around the world by the experts on the key elements in decarbonizing transport. And of course, we are very grateful for the support we've received from several different funding partners for this initiative. And there is a need to move from ambition to action. The work that we did a while ago reviewing all the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, showed that while over 80% of the NDCs do mention transport sector as one of the key elements in decarbonizing the economies, around 60% only provide transport mitigation measures. And remembering that the transport sector accounts for 23% of the global tank-to-wheel CO2 emissions. So it is extremely important for us to focus on the transport sector and decarbonization. So while the 60% of the NDCs provide transport mitigation measures, when you really dive into these measures, some of them are relatively vague. We will increase public transport share, but what is lacking in this is how you do it. What are the actual measures, the actions you're going to take in order to achieve these objectives? And the most worrying part of the NDCs, when we looked at them, is that only 10% provide a quantified CO2 reduction target for transport sector. So there's definitely room for improving and making the NDCs more actionable. And another notion and finding we had when we look at the NDCs, there's actually quite a big difference between the commitments in the NDCs and when you review the actual national transportation plans, which in some cases are more ambitious. So transferring those national plans to the NDCs and to the action is extremely important. So as an objective for the ITF Decarbonizing Transport Initiative, I mentioned earlier, we really want to move from ambition to action, but how to do that? From the beginning, our objective has been to build a catalog of effective CO2 mitigation measures for the transportation sector. And this we did launch our Transport Climate Action Directory this July. And I'm very happy to have our colleague Orla McCarthy to really go into and show you how this open directory works and how it can be in help to you, all the stakeholders in the government, in reducing CO2 emissions from the transport sector. In addition, we are providing, as we work on the initiative, targeted assistance for our countries, for our partners, to identify really the climate actions that work. And in the following presentations, you will see some of these examples on how we actually do this as well. And what we really want to do is put together and share evidence for those best practices that will accelerate the transition to carbon neutral mobility. Finally, as one final objective for our DT initiative is not only building that evidence base, but really is to shape the climate change debate, specifically in the transportation sector, by building a global policy dialogue and bringing really the transport perspective to the table from the transport experts and the sector itself. Within the DT initiative, we have several work streams, which you will see in the following presentations on how they actually translate that ambition to action. We have worked on progress tracking, the reviews of the NDCs, the work we do with our flagship publication, ITF Transport Outlook, where we really look at the impact of different policies at the global level, at the regional and national level on CO2 emission reduction potential over the next coming decades. We work on several different in-depth sectoral reports, maritime, aviation, road freight, urban passenger transport, and analyze very specific decarbonizing issues on the focus studies with specific transport modes or specific cases. In addition to that, we're working with several governments to help them to build national pathways to meet the transport CO2 reduction ambitions, and also supporting the governments in building the tools, the in-house tools, to really make that quantitative assessment possible also in the countries. And as I mentioned before, we are organizing global dialogue on transport climate change through our roundtables, through our ministerial roundtables at our annual summit in Leipzig, Germany, and through several technical workshops. And we really hope that we, as an international transport forum, with the mandate to work at the global transport policy issues on all modes of transport, can act as a conduit for transport sector for that climate change negotiations. So with that, I'm very pleased to give floor to my colleague Orla McCarthy, who will be showing and illustrating how the climate action directory that we have made available can help countries and stakeholders to decarbonize transportation sector. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jari. So I will just share my screen now. And hopefully that is okay. So Transport is key to climate action plans. And our models have shown that good progress can be made with the right policies. So a return to business as usual approaches to transport policies after the pandemic will see emissions due to transport continue to grow over future decades. On our current trajectory, which is the dotted line here represented in the graph in front of you, emissions from transport are expected to far exceed the necessary levels for the Paris Agreement. The good news is that emerging results from our current modelling, which is the solid blue areas that you see on the graph, also tells us that acting now to change policy pathways can result in transport achieving the necessary reductions for the 1.5 degree scenario. Now, I should say that these graphs are just a sneak preview. They are obviously emerging results. What we know is updating all the time, and the final projections will be available in the next edition of our flagship publication, The Transport Outlook, when it's published next May. And while this publication will quantify the general trajectory and identify the areas for transport worldwide to focus on, it is global modelling. And we equally recognise that further support is needed for individual governments and organisations to try to prepare targeted action plans and strategies appropriate to their region. So the ITF have developed a web tool, the Transport Climate Action Directory, as you heard Jari refer to it, or TCAD, which currently contains supporting evidence for over 60 measures for decarbonising transport. It is designed to help inform our members and partners in preparing their decarbonisation strategies and to incorporate transport actions in their climate action plans to really help people take the next steps from raising the ambitions to turning those ambitions into concrete actions. Now, the directory is not intended to be prescriptive and instead aims to provide information for understanding how measures work, what should be considered in planning their implementation, and an evidence base to aid decisions and case making. You will recently have received the latest version of the UNFCCC's Climate Action Pathway for Transport, and it sets out a clear direction of travel and milestones for decarbonising transport. And we really see the TCAD tool as supporting implementation planning for the pathway, where it can help users to understand how policy measures could work for them and identify underlying measures that could support the impacts in the action pathway. We hope it will also be of use in helping the incorporation of transport actions into the revised NDCs. So, different types of measures are needed for different types of transport activity. To run you through these summary results, for example, what you're looking at now is the non-urban passenger transport segment. And in that, our models considered the types of measures that will encourage development of new vehicle and fuel technologies, disincentivize fossil fuels, and improve intercity rail services. It's worth noting that carbon pricing would be central to reductions in non-urban passenger transport. Here we have the urban passenger transport sector. And authorities here should be considering appropriate measures for improving and prioritising sustainable alternatives to the private car, such as public transport, walking and cycling. Measures also for fostering new mobility solutions and for encouraging the greening of private, commercial and public vehicle fleets. And also in the longer term, integrated land use and transport planning to ensure sustainable development. And for freight, with increased ambition, substantial decreases in freight emissions are possible, which really contributes to achieving the Paris Agreement targets. Again, carbon pricing is important for getting those emissions down, along with measures to encourage fleet modernisation, transition to low carbon energy sources. Measures to support intermodal connections are important as well to realise integrated intermodal transport and logistics systems. And coordinated action to reduce aviation and maritime emissions will also be needed. But finally, as an example showing the benefit of holistic planning across sectors, efforts to reduce emissions in the energy sector also help reduce transport emissions. The switch of the energy sector to more renewable sources reduces demand for fossil fuels and consequently the demand to transport it, impacting freight emissions. So, we have included a breadth of measures in the TCAD, both measures that directly impact the CO2 emissions and those that enable the rollout of more sustainable choices. So for example, the setting of standards to give market certainty. We include measures that are for incentivizing or discouraging certain technologies or behaviors. But we recognize the need for our partners and members to plan the right measures in the right place. And we know there are a lot of measures out there. So in the TCAD, to help users with their plans, we have grouped the measures around policy outcomes, the ones that we think they're most likely to contribute towards, allowing governments and organizations in different contexts to research and plan the most appropriate interventions to achieve success in their region. So the 5 policy outcomes we've identified so far are mode shift and demand management, which covers measures that encourage more sustainable transport choices. Improved design, operations and planning of transport systems. This covers existing vehicles, operations and planning methods. Electrification, which contains measures that could contribute to the rollout and uptake of electric vehicles. Low carbon fuels and energy vectors relates to measures that encourage development and rollout of alternative fuels and low emission vehicles. And innovation and upscaling, which includes actions that can enable innovation and the scaling up of decarbonising or sustainable solutions for transport. So for example, a milestone in the UNFCCC's Climate Action Pathway for Transport is that cities with more than 1 million inhabitants have urban mobility plans in line with the Paris Agreement by 2025. We would see the TCAD as a great way of supporting city authorities in developing those mobility plans based on the detailed information included in the TCAD for the different measures. The measures can easily be filtered by geographic scope, so for example, to focus on urban appropriate measures, and by the type of measures such as economic, regulatory or infrastructure based, for example. And search results are also sorted by geographic scope and measure type to help with their review. Each measure description is designed to be relatively concise and consumable, with links to external sources then included in the measure overview. The description outlines what a measure is and how it works. The impact on CO2 emissions describes how the measure acts on CO2 emissions, for example, by directly reducing emissions or encouraging mode shift. It also includes measured or modeled impacts on CO2 emissions where they're available. The cost section describes potential sources of cost if you are looking to implement the measure, including quantifications as guidelines of the scale of costs involved. Potential co-benefits are also listed to help with evaluating business cases and further understanding how a measure could contribute to wider objectives. Equally, other considerations that may need to be considered or even mitigated in implementation planning are outlined at the end of the measure. As I mentioned, links to external literature and case studies are also provided to allow more detailed research once the measures have been selected. And related measures that you may also wish to consider are suggested and linked to at the end of the overview. Finally, as context counts, and what counts as an effective decarbonising solution is likely to be specific to each region. An indication of the regions considered in the overview is given at the end of the description, so that policymakers can take that into account. And the last thing I'd like to say on this is that we do see this very much as a knowledge sharing tool. So we invite and encourage users to use this platform to learn more themselves, but also to share what they know, so that partners around the world can learn from each other. We provide a link in every measure to a web form for users to register and submit their expertise on that measure, and in turn to help those looking to take effective climate actions for their transport sector. And thank you very much for your attention. I will hand you back to Wei Xuan.
Thank you very much, Yari and Orla, for sharing more of the ITF scope of work on decarbonizing transport, as well as more details on TCAD. And information on TCAD is available on our website, and we do welcome any feedback and comments as well. And I would also encourage all the participants and attendees to actually use the Q&A function to ask questions. We will have a discussion session at the end of this event, where we will then respond to the questions that are actually included in the Q&A. And next, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleagues. who have been working very hard on developing national pathways to decarbonize transport, both in Europe, both for the European Union as well as in emerging economies. So next in our session, we will be sharing more details in how to develop and implement such pathways and subsequent transport actions. So first we have Francisco Furtado, who will be sharing more on our project on decarbonizing transport in the European Union. And next we have Joshua Blanco, who will be sharing more on decarbonizing transport in emerging economies. Over to you, Francisco.
Hi, thank you, Ishran. And hello, everybody. Good morning or good evening, depending where you are. Um, my name is Francisco Furtado. I'm currently leading the work on decarbonizing transport in Europe. And I think this is a very good, this project is a very good example of some of the things my previous colleagues talked about on how the ITF work, how the Transport Action Climate Directory, and also other work that we do can help countries, can help regions to build and assess pathways to decarbonize transport. I'll just do a very brief background here on the role of transport in the decarbonization efforts and climate target efforts. This is for Europe in specific, and this measures how have emissions evolved since 1990. And as you can see in the European case, there was an overall decrease in emissions since 1990, with the exception of the transport sector. Now, this is what happens in Europe. This is not the same around other regions of the world where emissions have grown in other sectors too. But I think this illustrates the case for Europe, in particular, the importance of addressing, and Yari was talking this in his previous presentation, and how in the NDCs it's necessary to include the efforts to the transport sector. And I think this illustrates very well why in Europe, but also I would say in other regions of the world, this shows the challenge that it is, but the opportunities also that lie ahead for decarbonized transport. Now, going to the project. This project is a project funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. It has is one of the objectives to quantify the effects of different mitigation measures, to build scenarios to decarbonize transport in Europe, and to do all of this in a collaborative fashion, in dialogue with other European stakeholders, also sharing the results, sharing the data, so that the efforts that we do can be built upon and can contribute to the wider European effort to decarbonize the transport sector. So, how did we went about doing this? So there is these two big components in this project, as you could see from the objectives. One was having the stakeholder engagement, and by stakeholders we mean industry, academia, NGOs, other institutions interested and involved in decarbonizing transport, but also have a strong quantitative component to this work. And actually these two things went hand in hand and were very related. Because one of the first important things that we did was a couple of workshops on modeling development and identifying the measures that should be included in this study. Then we went about refining the modeling, improving the ITF modeling framework to address this. After we had another couple of workshops to define the scenarios themselves and a bit the range to what extent would these measures be applied in different scenarios. Then we, of course, ran the models, analyzed the results, and now we are at the stage where we are going into the discussion of what are the the policy implications and the implementation feasibility and strategies of implementations of these measures and these scenarios. Very briefly, all of these workshops I was mentioning are subject to a report. These methodological improvements to the models are also subject to reports. We have recently sent to the European Commission, and it will be discussed, the report which has the overview of the results that I was mentioning before. This will, after revision by the European Commission, this will all, and many of them are already available in the website I'm sharing now in the screen, and that will be available in the chat, if not now, a bit later after this presentation. And in June, we also intend to have an ITF publication that will encompass all of this work. Now, so what scenarios were this? Very briefly, we set two scenarios, one with current ambitions, which, as the name indicates, is what is already planned, what is already committed by the parties, what is assumed, not just assumed, but already committed and planned, and their strong commitments to implement. And then a high ambition scenario that pushes the measures that were implemented and even adds a couple of new ones and pushes the ambition, pushes the envelope, and requires a bit more bold action, but still within the realms of feasibility. So what measures are this? What are we talking about? I'll say that in this study, in total, there was 53 measures that were explicitly included and were tested, and their effects were evaluated. And we have, and these measures, most of them mirror and have, of course, are related with the measures that are in the Transport Action Climate Directorate. So we have economic instruments like carbon taxes, but not only that, distance charges for road freight, where trucks pay by the kilometers, by the vehicle kilometers they run, port fees to incentivize cleaner technologies on shipping, parking pricing and restrictions to parking in urban areas. These are all examples of economic instruments. Then we had another group, which was the enhancement of infrastructure. And here we're talking about Europe. So one of the things that's included is the incorporation of the TEN-T network investment plan. But other things are also included, for instance, transit-oriented development, improvements to public transport infrastructure, or a wider deployment of high-speed rail and even ultra high-speed rail like the maglev systems. Then we have measures that fall more in the operations part of the transport sector. An example is, for instance, shared assets in logistics, where both vehicles and terminals are shared between different companies, increasing the utilization rate of these assets, which also increases efficiency and decreases the emissions and the energy spent. Another example is, for instance, the optimization of aircraft movements that could also both be a contribute to efficiency and to decrease emissions. Of course, regulatory instruments, and some of them were mentioned by my colleague Orla, like the low emission fuel, low emission vehicles incentives, but also the fuel economy standards for internal combustion engine, for instance, for the trucking sector, speed limitations, mandates for sustainable aviation fuels. All of this are examples of regulatory actions that can be implemented. There's also the stimulation to innovation. We have intelligent transport systems for the trucking sector, hybrid planes for aviation, mobility as a service for urban mobility. And to cap this, I would mention a couple of trends or exogenous factors. They are not so much We call them exogenous because they are not within the transport sector itself, but they affect the transport sector. My colleague Orla already mentioned the issue of the decrease in fossil fuel consumption, and this could indeed have an important impact because around 30% of freight transport activity corresponds to movement of fossil fuels. So if there is a decrease in this, of course, there will be a decrease in activity and corresponding emissions. But teleworking is also a trend that's analyzed, or a reduced propensity to fly in the future. Now, going to the results. And these are, I would say, the key results that come out of this study. This is how the emissions evolve from 2015 to 2030 and then to 2050, also compared to two European targets, one which is to achieve a 60% reduction compared to 1990 levels, and another more recent associated with the Green Deal to reduce 90% compared to 1990 levels. And what we see, and it's encouraging, is that with a high ambition, it is possible to achieve the European objective of reducing by 60% emissions, or more than 60%, compared to 1990. And actually, in both cases, there is a reduction of emissions. In current ambitions, they reduce by 60% compared to 1990, and it's by 74% in a high ambition scenario. I would add that in urban transport, nearly complete carbon neutrality is possible to achieve, especially in the high ambition scenario, but it's also important, it's also possible a very sizable decrease even in the current ambition scenario. In the non-urban sector, there are greater challenges, and there are challenges of different natures. We can go into that in the discussion part. But also there, in the more ambitious scenario, a substantial reduction is possible that contributes to this decrease and achieving the 60% target. Although I should mention here as a caveat, the 90% target associated with the Green Deal that was issued last year, that one is still not achieved with these measures. We in these studies don't just look at the emissions and the climate component, or we also assess other types of impacts. As we know, the sustainable development goals have other features, have other dimensions to it. I won't go here into much detail, but we also look in questions of equity, resilience, and connectivity. And to finish, I would invite you all to have a deeper dive into this work. Consider this a bit as a teaser to what's going to happen next week, which is the final event of the Decarbonizing Transport in Europe project, where we'll discuss more in depth the project results, the scenarios feasibility, the policy implications that are here. You can see in your screen the link to the webpage of the event where you can register. It's open registration, so anybody can register and can attend this. And I hope you are interested and can participate and watch this series of webinars where we will go in more detail on the results of this project. And I'll finish to say again, I think this is an example of how ITF can assist countries and regions in building their pathways, adjusting their pathways, assessing the impacts and quantifying their impacts, and quantifying not only in terms of the climate targets to be achieved, but also other social and economic indicators. And with this, I finish. I thank you everyone for your time. And now I think I'll pass to other regions of the world.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Joshua Patinina Blanco, and I'm going to be presenting briefly the Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies project, DTE for short. First of all, why do we need to decarbonize transport in emerging economies? Why is this a priority? What you can see here first is the expected evolution in total CO2 transport emissions in emerging regions. This, as my colleague Orla introduced at the beginning, is the forthcoming results in the 2021 Transport Outlook. These are emerging results. And what we consider by emerging regions are those that you have at the bottom of the presentations. What you can see is that from 2015 to 2050, in spite of a drop in emissions in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have an increase of almost 50% in emissions if the ambitions of decarbonization policies are maintained to those shown in 2015. If we don't look at the total CO2 transport emissions in these regions, but rather at the share of emissions in these regions in global emissions, we see that in 2015, less than half of global CO2 transport emissions were emitted in emerging regions. However, by 2050, in the same trajectory, emissions from these regions would amount to more than 60% of total global emissions. This highlights the importance of decarbonizing transport in emerging regions and emerging economies. Now, the ITF has aimed at supporting authorities in moving from ambition to action for transport GHG emissions mitigation in these regions. And to go from ambitions to actions, what it has aimed at with this DTE project is to help authorities identify relevant measures and also develop and improve existing decarbonization pathways for the transport sector for all modes of transport, both at the national level and at local level. This is done in 4 main stages. A first qualitative overview that started in 2019 looks at the main challenges and opportunities for transport decarbonization in the implementation countries. This will be followed in the future by a quantitative stage, which will model the potential impact of different policy measures adapted to local specificities and aligned with measures found in TCAD. This will also be followed by capacity building exercises so that results and tools developed in the quantitative stage can then help inform future policy decisions. Finally, a policy dialogue and exchange will be running all throughout the project until 2022 when the project ends, between authorities at the national level, but also at the regional level and between different world regions. The project is supported and is organized thanks to the funding of the International Climate Initiative, ICI, by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, and it's implemented jointly between the ITF and the Wuppertal Institute. You can see more about the project in the link below. Now, in the first stage of the project, in this qualitative assessment, we have looked at the 4 implementation countries: Argentina, Azerbaijan, India, and Morocco. And what we have found is that these countries have similar policy priorities that go in parallel, but can be matched with decarbonization objectives. These are first, increasing the well-being of their citizens by increasing the citizens' access to opportunities and markets. Of course, another current priority is to promote post-COVID recovery. And in scenarios such as major cities, this also includes air quality improvements. But then also, these countries present similar transport challenges that go alongside decarbonization ones. These are to promote the economic competitiveness of freight transport systems, facing, in some cases, informal transport activities, and also enhancing the big potential these countries have for multimodality, knowing that most transport activities in these countries, both for passenger and freight transport, are done by road transport, which could be enhanced with other modes. Just as a mention, these analyses of opportunities and challenges is being done in the framework of 4 scoping papers. You can see in here the most recent one. The other 3 ones are going to be published in the future. Now that we saw that there are, alongside decarbonization, other policy priorities and other challenges for the transport sector, how can transport decarbonization in itself serve as an opportunity for facing these? We have aimed at framing these in the different stages of the project. When it comes to the qualitative overview, we have aimed at assessing the potential synergies across different policy matters so that benefits in terms of transport decarbonization can also mean benefits for other sectors. Just to give you a brief example, it would be possible to look at the positive impacts of asset sharing, as my colleague Francisco mentioned before, both for transport decarbonization and for instance, increasing the economic competitiveness of freight transport by increasing transport efficiencies. Then we also aim at looking at the complementarities with other existing projects. As my colleague Jari mentioned at the beginning, we don't aim at inventing the wheel, and we believe that synergies are necessary for being able to pass effectively from ambition to action. Then and just a mention, in our work, we aim at supporting authorities in the different challenges. Of course, in the current scenario, and particularly for emerging economies, one of these challenges is financial arrangements for decarbonization projects. So we briefly aim at highlighting potential financial arrangements where decarbonization could also aim at addressing other policy priorities simultaneously. When it comes to the quantitative evaluation framework that will be developed in the 4 countries, we will aim at measuring, whenever possible, both environmental but also economic and social impact, so that it's clear for authorities how is it that they can carry priorities in parallel. Then when it comes to the capacity building exercises, the tools that will be developed will complement and expand existing modeling tools in the 4 implementation countries. And training workshops will help show local and national authorities on how to pass from these tools to an actual process that informs new policy decisions in the country. Finally, when it comes to the policy dialogue and exchange, we aim at fostering exchange between different actors across various sections and sectors, both public and private. This will be done by workshops at the national level, but also with major regional workshops so that we can facilitate experience sharing among countries. I would like to invite you just to a special session at the ITF Summit linked to this very project in the forthcoming ITF Summit in 2021. These are examples of things that can help emerging economies deal with both the transport decarbonization challenges as well as other policy priorities and transport challenges. We are working in the 4 mentioned countries, but we would like to increase the impact of this project. So we will be very happy to listen into your thoughts on these and hearing to any feedback you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisco and Joshua, for sharing the various opportunities that exist for both developed and developing countries in decarbonizing the transport sector. And I will continue to encourage all our attendees to use the Q&A feature. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A and our speakers will respond to them at the end of this session. And next, we will go into city level measures. We know that cities are key to addressing global climate change, especially since urban areas are growing rapidly together with urban passenger transport demand, which could increase by up to 70% in 2050. So the next speaker, my colleague Dimitris, will share more information on our decarbonizing transport in Latin American cities, where we will hear more about opportunities for change in these cities. Dimitris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wei Xuan, and thank you for joining, everyone. Give me a second to share my screen. Now, as Weishuan mentioned, I will be presenting the work that we've been done in a project for Latin America. But let me start first of all with just saying some things in general about urban areas. As Weishuan mentioned, emissions from urban areas may increase under a current trajectory up to 50% to 2050. However, there are some of the areas with the highest potential. As you can see here on this graph coming from our emerging results from our modeling work, which will be showcased in the upcoming Transport Outlook, with a combination of measures, transport emissions from the urban passenger sector could reduce significantly. And why is that? Because the solutions we have and we are trying to encourage the adoption of are specially tailored for urban settings. For example, public transport, which is considered as a key to move into a low emission future, requires high transport volumes, and these are available in cities. Trips that happen in urban settings tend to be shorter, so they can be done by non-motorized modes. And last but not least, electric vehicles, a key solution for reducing emissions, are better tailored for the shorter trips that happen in a daily urban setting. Also, it is important to mention that several of the negative externalities associated with transport are more evident in urban settings, such as local pollutants or noise pollution. So the combination of all these measures, of all these issues, have made the urban sector, the transport sector, that is more active in adopting measures that may have a mitigating effect in emissions. And it's thanks to those measures that we actually see this potential of emission reduction. Nonetheless, it is important to acknowledge that that cities around the world face different challenges, and the challenges that the city in Europe, for example, might face are not the same with one in another part of the world. So in the ITF, we have engaged in this project, which is funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, and it's focusing on decarbonizing transport in Latin American cities. So this project is a combination of a qualitative and quantitative work, focusing in 3 cities, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Bogotá. And our chief aim is to, first of all, demonstrate the potential that these cities have towards decarbonizing, and use this project to consolidate knowledge on the potential solutions that exist. However, we also want, and it's similar to what my colleagues mentioned before, we want to use this as a platform for dialogue and information exchange between the cities, but not just them, also other cities in the region. And regarding the quantitative part, we aim to provide the cities with a quantitative tool that will be used to help them improve their decision making, in addition to anything else they might already have. Now, why did we choose these cities? First of all, they are in the same region, of course, but they also have common decarbonization goals and targets. The authorities, through our communication with them, have highlighted how important it is for them to reduce emissions and local pollutants. And they have signaled a different of possible measures, a different of possible solutions they are looking at. And here I'm listing some of them. For example, the creation of low emissions or no-car zones in the cities, the importance of active mobility and how this is translated through improved walking and cycling infrastructure. And also, I mentioned before, electric vehicles. This is something that they see, then they want to adopt policies that would increase the penetration of electric and other low emission vehicles in their vehicle fleets, both public and private. Now, these cities also face common challenges. They are 3 massive metropolises. They are the economic center of their countries. They're also the capitals of their countries. So they also face similar problems. They all have to deal with urban sprawl. They're huge metropolitan areas. And they also have a concentrated activity, economic activity in the center, which translates into heavy commuting flows in and out. They also have very big congestion problems, despite actually having low car ownership rates, at least compared with Europe or North America. Now, this also translates in a high model share for public transportation. However, this has been reducing over the last decade, over the last years. We see that public transport model share is reducing, goes down. Now, this also translates to an opportunity, and those cities do have common opportunities. Regarding public transport, as I said, it's dropping. However, it could remain high with the proper support in the policy and investment side. And it's important to say and to reiterate how the local governments and the local authorities show high willingness to make these cities people-centered environments. They want to put the individual, the person, in the center of this as the important part of the city. And to that, of course, active modes, which they already do play an important role, but the cities want this to continue to be the case. And at least pre-pandemic, these cities had a growing economy, which gave opportunities for development. Hopefully this will be something that they can return to when this whole thing calms down. Now, I'm going to go fast through some of the activities that we've done and things that we are planning to do. So we have organized a series of workshops in each of the 3 cities where we had local stakeholders and we collected a lot of information about the situation in the cities. But of course, we also used this opportunity to create this platform of exchange. So we had representatives from all the cities join us in all the workshops where they discussed what are the transport issues they're facing, what solutions have they tried, what worked, what didn't, and so on. And they expressed to us how beneficial this experience was for them. Now, using the information that we collected in these sessions, we have written a policy review report about the present and the future of transport in the cities and what are the challenges, the opportunities that they're facing, and so on. And this report will be published soon. It is currently in the publication process. Now, on top of that, for the quantitative part, we also had a series of workshops that were used to develop the ITF modeling tool that we're creating that will be used for enhancing local capacity, local modeling capacity. So let me go a bit more in detail about this qualitative assessment tool that we are developing. It is all based around a strategic modeling framework, which combines data sources from open source data that are available, local information that were provided by the cities, knowledge that the ITF has, or local experts. So it's a combination of a lot of information. And the idea is that this tool will give the ability to the cities to model the impact of the different policy measures and future infrastructure developments and how these affect emissions and transport activity. And during the workshops, we also designed together with the cities some scenarios that they want to test and what are some, and we validated the results. So everything that will come out of it is something that the cities have agreed and shows their support in this. Now, just to give you a little more information about the tool. So we take each of the cities. Here is the case of Mexico City, and it's split in zones. Here we have 30 zones that cover the entire metropolitan area of Mexico City. So this assessment tool estimates the transport flows and the model shares between the zones, and that is translated into activity, passenger kilometers, and emissions, CO2 emissions, local pollutants, and so on. And the tool also projects this evolution throughout the study period, how this will evolve to 2050, which is the time horizon we are working on, and then evaluates the impact of different policies or different measures on the zones, on the city in general, and so on. And I want to close up with some of the examples that of these policies that we are using, and the users, which will be the cities, will be able to use this tool to test different measures, different policy measures. For example, they could test what would be the impact of new public transport infrastructure, or what would happen in both in transport activity and emissions if they adopt low emission zones, car restriction schemes. It also enables to adjust pricing mechanisms, for example, for parking or public transport, and also to, if you want to boost active mobility, enhance cycling infrastructure, or create bike sharing systems. So these are some examples. And of course, we took a lot of knowledge that we had collected through our TCAD. And we also want this tool to be another option that the cities have when they want to decide their policy agendas in the future. We want them to use this in addition to any other models or assessment frameworks that they already have. There will be a final event, which is currently in the planning, which will demonstrate this tool and the main results that came out from this work, but there is no fixed time yet. It is scheduled to be sometime in the first 3 months of 2020. And we will share, of course, details when we have them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. And next, we'll actually go to our sectoral deep dive session. We do know that different climate mitigation actions exist in different transport sectors, which are also experiencing different levels of challenges. And so this section will provide a deep dive on the decarbonization of the heavy-duty vehicle industry and the road freight sector. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Mr. Paulo Gonzalo, who will be sharing more information on opportunities to decarbonize road freight.
Thank you, Weishuan. And hi, everyone. I'm just trying to put my slides on the screen. Here we go. Yeah, my name is Pierpaolo Cazzola. I'm going to talk about the work that we have done at ITF on the specific case of road freight. I'll try to be brief so that we can have time for the Q&A. So first slide is about the key pillars of moving towards sustainable decarbonized mobility. These are of general relevance, but all apply specifically also to road freight. So the pillars are essentially the management of travel demand, the transition towards efficient vehicles, the decarbonization of energy vectors and fuels, and then the minimization of emissions beyond those are imputable to vehicle use and fuel production, for example, those due to vehicle manufacturing and infrastructure construction. And then since we're talking about sustainability along with decarbonization, this has to be placed in the broader context of the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, so allowing to meet multiple targets, so and leading to co-benefits for safety, affordability, access, energy security, low emissions of local pollutants, connectivity, industrial development, and economic growth. So what I'm going to talk about next is how these different pillars apply to road freight and what we have done to inform the policy debate on this. So the first slide is about managing travel demand. So key actions that are necessary to ensure that this can be done in a way that is sound for decarbonization relate with the need to regulate or modulate the cost of transport to reflect the full impact of externalities. So this is true for freight, but it's for road freight, but it's true actually across the mode. So also for other freight movements. So key instruments are the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and the use of fuel taxes and carbon pricing. And also the transition towards pricing or charges that are sensitive to location, time, occupancy, and capacity utilization. So a couple of products we have, or reports we have, which are important are the two on the top on the right. One is about tax revenue implication on decarbonizing road transport, and the other one is about the smart use of roads. They are elements that essentially talk about, especially about these pricing changes. We also can enable the use of higher capacity vehicles to have a better use of the capacity, so reduce the activity to move the same amount of, deliver the same amount of ton kilometers. So we have a report there on high capacity transport is in the second line. We can foster physical compatibility, asset sharing, collaboration in logistics. We can leverage digital technology for optimizing routes and chaining trips. We can also capitalize on the experience of green freight programs and avoid sprawl, promoting compact cities, which essentially reduce the need for long distance transportation. These are things that are covered in a report called Towards Freight Decarbonization, but also in work we have done on the in the case of the logistic observatory, which the example in the publication here is about Chile, but that is essentially about how to making logistics better. And finally, I am also citing here the ITF Transport Outlook, which has a broader overview of these measures as well as others. Next is the need to enhance energy efficiency of vehicles. So key action here are either operational, for example, speed limits, or periodical driver training, for example, due to for eco driving. There are also important, and another important pillar relates with testing and standardization to enable the scale up of fuel saving technologies. There's an important report we have just released on these in September. This is about regulations for and standards for clean trucks and buses. Is the one with the blue track on the top right of the screen. Then we need to promote low and zero emission vehicles. And so that means using fuel economy or tailpipe CO2 emission regulation, other regulations which are on the rest of the life cycle emissions and relate with end of life, recycling, embedded carbon, sustainability of the supply chain of different materials used for vehicle production and also for fuel production. Then, as I mentioned earlier, also carbon taxes, differentiated taxation on vehicle purchase and road charges are important in this context because they can dissuade from the use of more carbon intensive vehicles, not only in terms of use, but also in terms of production. We need to enable EVs to become an asset rather than a liability for the electricity sector. So this is essentially EVs can rely on decarbonized electricity, but they cannot effectively do that unless they can shift their charging times according to what could be making electricity generation less carbon intensive. And then, of course, we need to support finance, not only for R&D, but also due to the fact that some of these technologies are more capital intensive, and so there's a need to transfer costs from the capital to the total cost of the cost per kilometer. On electrification, one report which is upcoming, and there's a box on the right is going to be focusing on how urban delivery vehicles can actually boost electric mobility. We're going to release these soon after this workshop on the 10th of December. So I encourage you to have a look and register at the webpage if you're interested in that. I also want to mention the ITF has been founding member of the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, which has exactly one of the aim. Essentially is the enhancement of energy efficiency of vehicles. So that's why you have the GFEI logo on the right. Next pillar is decarbonization, energy vectors and fuels. So key actions are related with the sustainability of transport fuel and energy vectors. In particular, for example, biofuels, the use of standards, the promotion of good practices, the promotion of low and zero emission energy vectors. I mentioned earlier decarbonized electricity, but this also applies to other fuels. So for these key actions are, for example, the priority given to low carbon electricity from renewables. This is in the energy sector, but it's a relevant move. And also the use of low carbon fuel standards in the case of transport fuels to encourage the deployment of technologies that can actually deliver lower emissions. We also have support for the deployment of refueling and charging infrastructure, and of course, again, R&D funding. Reports on the right are already appeared earlier, but just a key mention. So the one on the top on regulation on and standards for clean trucks and buses also covers energy vectors and fuels, in particular looking at not only electricity, already mentioned, but also hydrogen, and the need, for example, to ensure that there's a proper accounting for the way hydrogen is produced, and which is something that requires the development of regulatory arrangements called guarantees of origin, for example. So that means if you shift to hydrogen, you also can have a way to enable you to ensure that you can shift to low carbon hydrogen, not just to any type of hydrogen. Next slide is about the need to look at what goes beyond vehicles and fuel use, and so the need to minimize material need per unit of freight transport service, and also to reward efficiency in design, fabrication, use, and end of life. So again, here is where this report on regulation on clean and standards for clean trucks matter. So it's also where the high capacity vehicles can help because of the lower material requirement per the same amount of service, is where better logistics can help, and is where our report on covering the broad spectrum of different solutions for road freight decarbonization can deliver. Can deliver good inputs. So when it comes to making all this happen, and I think this applies broadly, so our recommendation are to look for win-win solution, to account for life cycle perspective when looking at transport for road freight, but also for any other mode, and to look also at opportunities which are just not limited to the transport sector, in particular the idea of integrating well low carbon technologies for road freight transport with what would actually improve the way we deliver emission reduction in other sectors, for example, power generation. So for this, we think we need a clear vision, and that means we have an important. There's a high relevance of analytical work, but also we need to work closely with governments. And on this, I want to bring up again the point on national pathways and the policy dialogue and the work that the ITF has been doing here, thanks to projects such as the DTU, the DTE, and the DLA that were mentioned earlier by colleagues. So that's it. I think this was quick and without going in depth on the key insights of the reports, I let you do that yourselves. I'm gonna upload now to the chat a few lists of key links that you may actually use to access all these reports. Here you have them on screen. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Pier Paolo. And Nick, so before we move on to the discussion sessions and to respond to some of your questions, I would like to have you answer some of our poll questions. So we've prepared a short poll for all the attendees here today. And this will help us identify some of your priorities and how to guide the discussion session. So you will see 4 questions on the screen shortly, and we'll give you maybe 2 or 3 minutes to respond to these questions, and then we will then move on to the interactive discussion session. And as we're waiting for all of the votes for the poll, we will maybe ask some of our speakers to respond to the questions, some of the questions that we've received in the earlier sessions. And so we have received some questions about developing countries, how the TCAD tool will be applicable in countries like Uganda. And I shall now invite my colleague Orla to respond to that question, perhaps. And if there are other presenters who would like to contribute, please feel free to do so as well.
Sure, thanks very much, Rachel, and thank you for the question. So in each measure overview that you can select in the TCAD, at the end of the overview, we do include a list of the regions where the literature was sourced. So that will be indicated in the measure itself if that information is already included. There's also a lot of contextual information in the measure overview, which can help countries and specific regions to identify if the measure is applicable to them. But equally, again, I would say we are very much open to knowledge sharing through this. If there are additional case studies that we have not yet been aware of in the TCAD, please also do feel free to recommend them through the link provided in each measure. And on that note, we will continue to build as our own understanding grows. We will continue to add to the TCAD. And so the projects that Joshua has already presented, Demetrius, and other future projects on emerging economies will be then the results and greater understanding that we gain from those will be incorporated into the applicable measures in the catalogue itself. And then I think there was a follow-up question on the reporting. So I'm not an expert on the reporting process itself, but my understanding would be that the TCAD and the other projects will help with providing the necessary information for evaluating specific measures, which can include domestic mitigation measures as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Orla. And we also have a question on logistics and transport, how it will always be a major factor in the economy, even in the circular one. So how does a program that is in line with the EU Green Deal and national targets help the national efforts? An example was given in Ireland. So perhaps, Per Paulo, you would like to take that question in terms of aligning national targets together with other CO2 emission reduction measures in transport and logistics.
Sure, thanks, Weishan. So as far as I understand, there's a citation on the Lean and Green program. So Lean and Green is what has been characterized in my presentation as a green freight program. It's essentially something that allows players, stakeholders in the logistic community to get together and work in ways that can foster the best practices. For example, if some of them have developed experiences with low emission vehicles and they can share information with other partners in a way that is cooperative, collaborative, rather than competitive. There are also tools enabled by green freight programs to increase the capacity of companies that would have limited access to the idea of sharing assets or the possibility to share assets, to actually go in that direction and ensure, for example, that heavy goods are transported along with light goods in the same truck, maximizing the capacity utilization of the truck when it comes to both weight and volume limitations. So these are all just examples of cooperative work that can actually overall deliver quite significant improvements in the way goods get moved around, and so increases, if you want, the possibility to move goods, and so deliver on correctly the question points at the fact that there will always be a role for logistics, even in a decarbonized reality. So this means you can still have that role while minimizing the amount of vehicle kilometers that you need to deliver that. So that is important, is an important pillar of what you need to do on decarbonization.
Yes, if I can add just a couple words on this. This actually is in the Transport Climate Action Directorate. One of the measures is this type of voluntary programs. As Pier Paolo was saying, I think they have a big value in the dissemination and sharing of best practices. And we were talking about emerging economies, and I can give an example from our work in Argentina, where they also have a Programa Inteligente de Transportes, a smart transport program. And one of the things they told us of the benefits of this program is to raise awareness in the companies, in the private sectors, of the benefits of the measures them itself. For instance, things that increase the vehicle efficiency and decrease the fuel consumption, like putting aerodynamic add-ons to the trucks. Many truck drivers were not aware that this would reduce fuel consumption. Some of them actually bought those, but just for the aesthetics of it. So this is just an anecdotal example, but this shows how important these programs are in disseminating the advantages that some of these decarbonization measures have. And like we were discussing, not just on developing countries and developed countries, but also in emerging economies. And just to finish in a wider note, when we are discussing here the decarbonization of transport, and Pier Paolo mentioned it in the beginning of its intervention, we look at it in a holistic way of the impacts it will have in other sectors, in a perspective that this transition can contribute to economic growth, can generate a bit of a decoupling even between economic growth and transport activity, can generate other benefits. And it doesn't mean necessarily that suppress demand, meaning what I mean is we don't necessarily need less logistic activity, or at least the end result of the logistic activity to be reduced to decarbonize the sector. And I think we've been here showing several measures like the electrification of vehicles, the increase in efficiency in the utilization of these vehicles, better logistical optimization, modal shift to less carbon intensive modes. All of this can enable us to keep with the activity, the economic development, even more so in some regards, and still decarbonize the sector. So.
Thank you very much, Francisco and Pier Paolo. And I know that many of you are also asking about the recording of this session, as well as slides. So the link to the recording will be made available on our event webpage. And we will also share that information to all registered attendees after this event. And the recording will be available from Monday onwards, so the 7th of December. Great. So now we have ended our poll. Thank you all so much for responding to the questions. And so in terms of the first question, in order to achieve the Paris Agreement targets in the transport sector, what are the options that should be UNFCCC's party's main focus? And the majority of our voters picked all of the above. So we have a wide range of options that are priorities for many parties. And in the second question, there is also a range of how feasible we think we could align passenger transport decarbonization with COVID-19 economic recovery, especially in emerging economies. So many of you, 46% of you think that it will be low feasibility. So we've not actually discussed the impact of COVID-19, and maybe some of our speakers would like to touch upon that. And the third question, in terms of what should be the policy priority for cities in Latin America or in other developing parts of the world to decarbonize transport, we do see enhancing public transport and expanding the existing network as one of the top priority. And so I will invite maybe Dimitris to actually comment on this. And the fourth and last question on what will matter the most to decarbonize road freight transport, while maintaining economic and social development. And so the majority of the votes went to shorten supply chains. So it does seem that there are a lot more we need to do to collaborate with other key stakeholders, maybe even beyond the transport sector, in order to decarbonize the sector. And so I shall invite Francisco, first of all, to respond to the poll results that we're seeing in the first question in terms of how to achieve the Paris Agreement targets.
Hi, thank you, Sharon, again. I'll be very brief. I mean, these results, I think, reflect a big truth, the truth, which is we do need to do all of the above. And I think it's good that the audience here shares this view that we need to act on all of these levers: investment in infrastructure, regulation, support for technological development. It's interesting that the support for new mobility services, this is interesting, that got 0%, and I think it's something that we should reflect upon. But because all of these measures, namely the investment in infrastructure, the regulations, the support for technological development, actually, they need indeed to be applied in an integrated fashion. So to deploy electric vehicles, you also need to deploy the electric infrastructure, the distribution infrastructure. You need the charging infrastructure. You need also the regulations and the standards to make the deployment of these vehicles actually cheaper and interoperable between different countries and different regions, and even different sectors of the economy, so that there are standards in place. And you need the support also for the technological development to get, for instance, batteries, or in the particular case of the freight sector, we know that carbon neutrality of long-haul heavy road freight is challenging, and there's not commercially readily available alternatives yet. There's a lot of tests and trials and promising solutions, but there's not one ready and commercial out there. So the support of technological improvements, I think, is also very relevant, particularly in this in certain sectors like the one I just mentioned of road freight.
Thank you, Francisco. And now on the topic of COVID-19 economic recovery and aligning some of the decarbonization efforts with COVID-19 policy responses in emerging economies, I would like to invite my colleague Joshua to actually comment on this poll results, because the majority of you think that it's infeasible to do so.
Yes. Thank you very much, Weishan. I think that results are quite interesting because they highlight the complexity of carrying out economic recovery while also responding to the climate imperative that we have nowadays. Now, as countries, as cities move slowly towards thinking on how to go to economic recovery, of course, especially in emerging economies, markets and job markets are reopening, and people are going to increasingly need to go back to work, to commuting, for, especially if we're speaking about passenger transport. In these circumstances, rebuilding the trust of commuters into collective passenger services is going to be essential. This is not always an easy solution and an easy situation to deal with for authorities at the local and national levels, but dealing with this complexity in a case-by-case scenario, and also looking at how different policies can complement objectives for economic recovery and also for decarbonization is going to be continuously essential. So I think, just to wrap up, it's interesting, it highlights the challenge, it also highlights the fact that we need to move towards thinking in synergies and not only about economic recovery or only about decarbonization, but rather both.
Thank you, Joshua. And now moving forward to priorities in Latin American cities. We do have the poll results showing that most of our attendees think that we need to enhance public transport and expand existing network. So Dimitris, over to you.
Thank you, Aishwan. Well, I would have to say that this is a very sensible answer. Obviously, it is not something that can or should be done in isolation, but this is something that local governments and stakeholders have been doing. So public transport is a priority for cities, especially big cities in Latin America and in other parts, the other developing countries in the world, because it can be used also as a social policy. However, it is important to point out that combining public transport developments with other measures, often trying to create obstacles for other modes such as private car that have a bigger environmental impact and societal impact is important. So I think, and this is what we are trying to do through our work in the region, is to highlight how important it is to bundle things together and try to combine infrastructure developments with policies that actually augment their impact, their final effect. So I do agree. Just to summarize, I do agree with what people said should be a #1 priority, but it is important that we do not do it just by itself. We just do the infrastructure, and then that's the end of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitris. And it has just been pointed out to me that I have actually misinterpreted the poll results on the question of aligning passenger transport decarbonization with COVID-19 economic recovery in emerging economies. So I think most of the responses are relatively neutral. So 1 being impossible and 5 being extremely so. We do have the majority of the voters voting 3 and 4. And so, Joshua, if you don't mind, would you respond to this? So I think it is rather positive that most of our attendees do believe that it is indeed likely to align decarbonization efforts with COVID-19 recovery measures.
Yes, thank you, Weishan. I would just like to say the fact that in the poll, we do have many positive results, but it's not the only thing that we have. And we do have some respondents who highlight the challenges of aligning these 2 objectives. And I think that that's a reality that we need to face in all regions of the world, but especially in emerging economies. So raising up to the challenge, I think, is the main conclusion that we can draw from these poll results. It's something that we need to do in the transport sector.
Thank you, Joshua. And moving on to the last and final poll question on decarbonizing road freight transport. So we do have the majority of the attendees selecting shortened supply chain as one of the, as the most important measure for decarbonizing road freight. And so Pier Paolo, do you have any reflections on that?
Hi, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I see there are lots of fans of electric roads in our audience. So nobody picked that one, but anyway, yeah, it's interesting, I think, to see that answers are quite distributed across the different solutions and actions. In a way, I think this fits with the first answer, all the above, that was given at the top. So my thoughts are effectively, I think it's in line with what we also assessed. There's an important need to take action across the board. Shortening supply chains, optimizing logistics, using low emission vehicles, and reducing carbon content of fuels are all important solutions for a massive challenge, which is the decarbonization of transportation. it's unlikely the only one solution will emerge as the key one. So that is also interesting because it means everyone has its own stake in contributing to this challenge and trying to find solution, which is very good. I think we are all interested, I think, in playing our part in this space.
Thank you, Pier Paolo. And next, I will invite Yari to give some reflections on the poll results and perhaps some closing remarks as well.
Thank you, Weishuan. Interesting poll results. The first thing on just reflecting some of the questions, but also the responses. I think the fact that many feel that we do need all the measures to decarbonize transportation sector and to achieve the Paris Agreement goals is something that, first of all, our results on the work we do support fully this notion. But it also highlights the difficulty of the task and the challenge in terms of the political feasibility of putting in place several different measures at the same time. And for that, I think it's extremely important that we have clear communication. We communicate very clearly about the impacts of the policies and also about the co-benefits to achieve other sustainable development goals at the same time as we are tackling the climate action, the climate challenge. So for that, we need clear evidence, we need data, we need impact assessments, and I do hope that our tool, the TCAD, is one of those tools for the whole transport sector to really pick up that and help in communicating not only benefits in terms of decarbonizing the transport sector, but also other sustainable development goals, including growth, which is an extremely important part now that we're coming out of the pandemic crisis. Related to the COVID-19, just one more thing that I wanted to say on the opportunity. We do look at that also in our ITF Transport Outlook, where one of our key scenarios is a reshape scenario. So the COVID-19 is, in a sense, an opportunity to reshape the transportation sector to better meet the climate objectives. And examples of these are, obviously, simple example is the stimulus packages, which should include an environmental component in those as well. So, and we've seen our cities, many of the cities, reshaped to include much more active mobility, bike lane, walking pathways, and making these a part of the future cities is also one way of reshaping our cities. And just on the public transport in the emerging economies and the cities, in Latin American cities particularly, I think that the role of informal public transport is extremely important in these cities, and formalizing those services is also one way of improving the public transport. And perhaps with some of the new innovations, shared mobility solutions could be one way also to enhance the service quality for those people living in these cities. So those were just a couple of short reflections from my side on the questions and the answers that we're giving. So I think we have come to an end of our event. First of all, I just want to thank you all for joining this ITF special event. As mentioned before, the slides and the recording will be made available on the dedicated website. You will get an email also as a registered participant on the link to that. And to my understanding, also the recording, at least the slides, will be made available at the UNFCCC special event pages as well. So I hope you can reach to those. I also hope that you have found this useful and are convinced, as we are, that decarbonizing transport is possible. The actions are there, while we can also decarbonize the sector with opportunities for improving other sustainable development goals, including access to opportunities, air quality, economic growth. We at the ITF, we are certainly available for our member governments, but also beyond the whole transportation sector to support the efforts in decarbonizing the transport and as part of our DT initiative. And as you see, working not only, we're working at the level of regions, at the level of countries, cities, and modes themselves. So we are available and we welcome you to get in touch with ITF on any of these questions. We will at the ITF continue the dialogue. This dialogue on climate change and decarbonization of transport. Next one at our annual summit, 26th and 28th of May in Leipzig, Germany, with minister level roundtable on transport and climate change. And of course at COP26, where we will be organizing series of events with participation from a wide range of transport stakeholders, but also stakeholders beyond the transport sector. As was mentioned, it's extremely important for engaging with other sectors, not only the transport. So finally, again, I would like to thank you all for your participation and please stay safe. Thank you. And over to you, Weishran.
Thank you, Jari, and thank you to all our attendees who have been staying with us over the past hour and a half. And we are looking forward to meeting all of you in person, hopefully, at COP26. Thank you.